Earlier in the course, I mentioned that I like to categorize directives into three general categories, and I call them DOM directives, behavior-driven directives, and data-driven directives. Now, as mentioned, these names are just things I made up, but it's a good way to think about the different techniques you can use as you're going to write your directives. And in this particular module, we're going to be focusing on the DOM-driven directives, and you'll also see a little bit of a behavioral-driven directive as well. We'll kind of merge those two concepts together here. Now, I talked about the DDO way back in Module 1, and that's the Directive Definition Object. And we talked about that there's several different properties here you can define. And one of those key properties that we're going to focus on here is the link function. Now, the link function is really all about DOM manipulation. So there's a lot of directives out there. They're going to be using the link function. As an example, if I was going to be writing some type of a calendar directive, then I'm probably going to be doing a lot of tables with manipulation or divs with different layout with CSS, and that all involves a lot of DOM. Or I might want to make it when somebody hovers over a div. I want to have a directive that does something, and well, that's going to be handling DOM events in that particular case. Well, the link function works really well for all of those. Now, before I talk about the link function, this is an example of how I like to structure my directives, and you're going to see this moving forward. Now, this is a very, very subjective type of thing and approach, but it's what I've come to over the last couple of years and what I like. So first off, I always like to have an outer wrapper function, and you saw this earlier in the course, and then I self-invoke it, and that'll pull everything in here out of the global scope, so we don't have any global variables here. And then I like to focus on just the function for the directive. Now, I do this for controllers and factories and services and all that type of stuff as well. But the reason I like this is we're focused not so much on Angular right here, but more on just the functionality that we need. Then once we get that all done, then I find the module and name my directive and then just plug this particular function into my directive. I found it keeps it very clean, but you could certainly do many variations of this. This is, like I said, very subjective. Now let's get back to the link function. So the link function itself, as mentioned, is all about DOM manipulation, and it links the template for the directive to the scope. So really you could say it links the data to the view, if you will. And I like to think of directives as just kind of being like views and controllers, but a more small scale type of approach. So you can see in this link function that we have three different parameters passed in, and a little later you're going to see there's even more we could have. But out of the box, this is going to represent the scope, and you'll notice there's not $scope. Now, I could put that here, but it's always going to be these three parameters, so it really doesn't matter what you name it. I could call it S in this case. It's a little bit different than the injection that we're used to. These are three parameters you always get. So the scope is either going to be the shared scope or it's going to be the isolated scope. Really depends on how you set up your directive. Now the element is going to represent either the element that your directive is applied to in the case of it's an attribute, or it's going to be the tag itself if you define your directive as an element. So I kind of break this out here. So isolated or shared scope, that's going to be the scope. Your element is the element the directive is actually on, or it could be the element, because you might just define your directive as an element. And then finally we have the attributes, and that's going to be all the different attributes on that particular tag or element. And so that allows us to get to everything we need, and now we can start to manipulate things, add children, read values from attributes, and much, much more. Now when it comes to DOM manipulation, if you've ever used something like jQuery, then you'll feel right at home, although it's a much smaller scale, because AngularJS, to manipulate the DOM, provides something called JQLite. Now here's the definition from their actual documentation. JQLite is a tiny API-compatible subset of jQuery that allows Angular to manipulate the DOM. Now this is kind of your middleman between the DOM and your directive. Now you can always write custom JavaScript, vanilla type JavaScript if you'd like. That's also a possibility. But some of the functionality, such as adding classes, and we'll see more in just a moment, is just built into this JQLite. Now, one interesting thing to mention here If you do happen to load jQuery itself, the script library, before Angular, then AngularJS will actually replace JQLite with the full version of jQuery. Now, I personally find that I really don't need jQuery in really any of the Angular apps we've done for customers over the last few years. Now, that's not to say you won't, but just keep in mind that by default you get this little mini-me, I call it, version of jQuery. But it is possible to use the full jQuery if you wanted. But like I said, I normally am not doing that. Now, here's some of the key features and functions that are part of JQLite. So to get to the actual element we want to work with and get it in this little JQLite wrapper, instead of the little jQuery dollar thing you do, you can say angular.element. And we'll be seeing this in a moment. There's an add class and a CSS function. So if you want to add a CSS class, or if you just want to use an inline style, you can use CSS straight from jQuery. There's an adder function to get to attributes and manipulate those. On and off for different types of events. There's even bind and unbind, although nowadays I would recommend on and off because that's more common, especially in the jQuery world. There's a find. Now the find only finds tags. In jQuery you can find by class or ID or really complex selectors, but in this world you can only find by tag name. There's an append and a remove if you'd like to add different child nodes or remove those. You can update the inner HTML or the inner text if you'd like to do that on a given tag. And there's even a ready function to be notified when the DOM is officially ready, or when the DOM content has been loaded, I should say. Now, there's more than this. We'll take a look at it briefly here in just a moment as far as the documentation, but this is the core set of features you get, and if you've done any jQuery at all, these will look really familiar to you. Now, if you haven't, keep in mind you don't have to use these. They're provided as a nice cross-browser way to manipulate, attributes or styles or add children or whatever it may be, but they're certainly optional. So now that you've seen some of the fundamentals of what the link function is and how it is going to be using JQLite, let's jump into a demonstration.